Welcome to the first lecture covering Chapter 8 of our textbook. The topic of this chapter is legally managing employees. In Chapter 7, we talked about how we can lawfully hire employees. And in this chapter, we're going to talk about what happens in the employment relationship after you have successfully hired an employee. This topic could be covered in several courses. In fact, an HR program this material would be covered in several courses. And so this textbook attempts to cover a very, very broad subject in a very, very small space. As a result, it introduces a set of topics, but doesn't really do more than that. So one thing I want you to be aware of as you are going through this chapter is that you are getting a little bit of knowledge about it. You're getting introduced to some concepts, but you are not being given enough information for you to become an expert or even to become sufficiently knowledgeable about these topics to make decisions on. And in most cases, you're being given enough information so that you can involve other people who might become subject matter experts. You kind of know what the issues are so that you can talk meaningfully and get meaningful advice from HR professionals or employment attorneys and people that really do have a greater depth of knowledge in these areas. So keep that in mind. It's a little bit like if you were to hear a 2-hour lecture on algebra and you've never been exposed to algebra before, and then thinking that you'd be able to master the final exam in the algebra course. You wouldn't, but you wouldn't know what you didn't know unless you had been exposed to the breadth of the information. So let's get started. Okay, so we're going to, actually we've already talked about how to legally select employees. That was the topic that we had in Chapter 7, so that's not really one that we're going to cover again. We're going to talk about discrimination charges and how you can avoid the possibility of discrimination charges, or at least reduce, I shouldn't say avoid. There's always going to be a possibility. If you manage a group of people for most of your employment life, you are going to have a charge of discrimination. You're probably going to have several times where that issue comes up. It would be odd if it didn't. Hopefully most of the time, hopefully all the time, they will lack merit. But being smart about the decisions that you make can reduce the likelihood of those results, and certainly can dramatically impact the likelihood of those charges having merit and having the ability to negatively impact your business. We're also going to discuss employee leave, employee compensation, and also employee performance appraisals. And we'll also talk about unemployment claims and how managers can be involved in that process. And by appropriately navigating that process can save the employer a significant amount of money. We're going to talk about employee agreements versus employee manuals, what's the difference between the two, and what is the law in general terms in the state of Texas. We'll talk about having a non-discriminatory work environment, and we'll talk about sexual harassment, both what to do when you get a charge of sexual harassment and hopefully what you can do to avoid or make those types of charges less frequent. And we'll talk very briefly about what types of employment records that are you required to retain. Okay, so that's kind of our to-do list of things for this chapter. Again, it's a very ambitious list. Any one of these bullets we could probably talk about for several hours. In fact, I think without exception we could talk about these for several hours, and we don't have that much time, so we're really just going to introduce those topics. During this first presentation, we're going to focus upon these first 3 items. And again, kind of explore the topics to some degree so we become a little bit more familiar with them. And then in subsequent lectures, we'll go on and talk about additional topics. Okay, so we're first of all going to talk about this first one, employee relationships, employment relationships. What is an employment agreement? Well, of course, the employment agreement is the foundation of the employment relationship. The employment relationship is at its core an economic relationship. The reason that people go to work, some of them love their jobs, some of them get a lot of satisfaction out of their jobs, but at the end of the day, we all have bills to pay. We all have needs that we need to meet through the employment relationship. So it is at its heart an economic relationship. And so we're really talking about a contract. Just like when we were talking about the contract chapter, the employee is agreeing to provide certain consideration, certain labor, certain services, and the employer is agreeing to provide certain consideration too. Typically this will be in the form of wages, but sometimes it can also include other things. That is what is at the heart of the employment contract or the employment agreement. And obviously, because it's the central aspect of that relationship, it's really important that you understand kind of what's going on in that. It is rare in the state of Texas, and I would say really anywhere in the United States, for employment contracts to be reduced to writing. Not quite sure why that's true, but it just is true, and it's unlikely that you or I will change that. People who have an employment agreement are few and far between. They mainly fall into one of three categories. The first category are people who have some kind of contract with the government. They might be people in the service, they might be teachers. Those are two categories of folks who typically do kind of have some kind of written agreement between themselves and their employer. Oftentimes these agreements exist because it's important for the employer to kind of lock somebody in for a certain period of time. You don't want your teachers leaving in the middle of the semester. That's not going to result in a very good learning experience for the students. Similarly, you don't want your soldiers being able to desert in the middle of the battle, right? So for those reasons, the employer has a strong incentive to want to kind of guarantee, to the extent that it can be guaranteed, that this person is going to fulfill a certain period of time. And so that's why we have contracts for those very specialized employment relationships. So that's one category. Another category are senior executives in companies. Again, it's kind of a similar reason. These are people who are making the big picture decisions. And so we don't want to have turnover in that function kind of we're in the midst of making big decisions. We want to be able to handle transitions in leadership smoothly with lots of planning and advance notice. Obviously that's not always possible, but that's the goal, and that's why for those very few positions we want to have employment contracts. When I was at JCPenney had about 150,000 employees. There were times where there were no employees who had employment contracts. There were other times where there was maybe 2 or 3 dozen people that had employment contracts. It was never a very large number. And so you can see how, yes, they exist, but the likelihood of you being affected by an employment agreement is pretty unlikely until you're very, very senior. And even then, most people never have an employment agreement between themselves and their company. So those are the first two categories. The third category is in the union situation. When a union represents a group of workers, the union and the employer negotiate, and if the negotiations are successful, the parties enter into a collective bargaining agreement. That collective bargaining agreement serves as a contract between the employees in that bargaining unit and the employer. It's not individualized to a particular employee. So maybe there's, we'll say, 50 employees in this unit. Obviously, no one of those employees gets everything he or she wants. All the employees, or each one of the employees, have kind of their own things that they value most highly. Some want good benefits, some want higher wages, some want better working conditions. There's can be all kind, somewhat more seniority or job security. There can be all kinds of different factors that are important. And so while all employees who work in that particular unit are going to be under the terms of that agreement, it's not as if each one of those parties gets exactly what they want in the agreement. So anyway, that's how an employment agreement works. But as I said before, the vast majority of folks don't have a written contract. So does that mean they don't have an employment agreement? Absolutely not. You can't be in a working relationship and not have an employment agreement of some type. But the agreement isn't going to be in writing traditionally. It's going to be verbal, oral. It's going to be spoken. You may receive an email, you may receive a letter giving you information about your salary increase. And so there will be certain aspects of your agreement that will likely be in writing. You'll also get what are called summary plan descriptions, which are benefit summaries, or you'll get at least an email link to those documents. So there will be certain aspects of your employment relationship that is documented, but many of the aspects of the agreement will not be documented in a written form. And exactly which one of those documents becomes the agreement or not can be a little bit amorphous. So you can't expect all of that to be in one place, in one document. That's just not realistic in our culture. Now, there are cultures that have a different set of expectations. So if you have ever worked internationally, you may find that the answers to these questions are a little bit different. Let's talk about the topic of employment at will. We talked about this in our last chapter, but just a little bit of a reminder. This is the idea that any employee can leave his or her employer at any time, with or without notice, with or without cause. It also means that the employer has the same options. The employer can end the employment relationship with or without notice, with or without cause. The only limitation on the employer is that the employer can't make that employment decision for an illegal or unlawful reason. But the number of unlawful reasons are pretty small. Employers can make lots of bad, stupid, mean, unpleasant, unfair decisions that are perfectly lawful. And the employee may feel very wronged, probably is very wronged, but in most cases won't have any kind of legal recourse. This is a surprising thing for most American workers. Most American workers think that their employer is required to treat them fairly. That isn't at all the case. I don't think it's the case anywhere in the United States, but it definitely is not the case in Texas at all. So you have to be able to point to a statute that says, I am protected from this type of termination for this particular reason. And then you have to be able to prove that that reason is actually the reason that that employment action was taken. That presents several hurdles for you to cross. It can happen, but simply feeling the decision was unfair is not a part of that process. Okay. So let's talk about some of the documents or some of the aspects of the relationship that develop. A pretty common way that the employment relationship begins is with the offer letter. An offer letter is a term that you can see is from contract law. We talked about the offeror makes an offer, and then the offeree has the option of accepting that offer. You may recall that language. And if the offeree accepts that offer, then we have an offer and acceptance, so therefore we have an agreement, and that's one of the 4 elements of contract. Well, we're using that same terminology here, and it means exactly the same thing in this context, and that makes sense because the employment relationship is just a type of contract. So oftentimes the employer will send an offer letter to the employee, and in that letter, typically the employer will explain what he or she is specifically offering the employee. Typically, information that's provided is the wage rate, the title, maybe some description of the job duties, the start date, maybe where the office location will be, perhaps who the manager is, maybe also information about benefits. It's pretty common for a savvy employer to also include some kind of statement in that offer letter about the employment at will status. There may also be some information about how the candidate should accept the offer. Many times the offer letter isn't actually sent until the offeree, the potential employee, has accepted the offer. So there may have been some conversations back and forth, and the offeree may have actually said, yes, I accept the offer, and then the offer letter is sent out to kind of memorialize that type of transaction. Is the offer letter a required part of the hiring process? Absolutely not. It's a nice touch to do. It's a sign, I think, of respect for the employee. It's also a way to clearly communicate expectations and to dot the I's and cross the T's, which can help later on in the process. So it's a smart thing to do, but it is by no means required. You can conduct the entire offer and acceptance process over the telephone. I mean, heck, you could do it through smoke signals or text messages or any number of other approaches. But an offer letter is a good process, especially if this is a position that's going to be full-time or that you hope is going to be a long-term type of relationship. Now, if you're hiring somebody temporarily for a couple of weeks over Christmas or something like that, well, you may find that the offer letter may be a little bit more of an arduous time drain than you have, and so it may be something that you decide not to do in every single case. But I would encourage you to do it pretty often for people that you expect will be with you for quite a while. And certainly I would recommend you do it for supervisors and for managers. It can even be a good process to use when you are promoting a candidate or relocating a candidate from one location to another. Again, this is an opportunity to reaffirm that this particular employee has at-will status. Let him or her know about the position and the job duties, what the compensation will be, and when that transition happens. And that can be a good paper trail to document that you've covered everything and that the employee understands what the expectations are. That sets up a good situation for success in the relationship. Many times the employment relationship goes awry when the communications are not clearly conveyed to that person, and so that person doesn't have all the information that he or she needs to be successful. Let's talk about an employee manual, or handbook is another term for this one pretty commonly. An employee handbook or employee manual is designed to give to the employee an overview of the policies, maybe the benefits, the practices of that particular employer with respect to the employees that that company has. I guess one thing to keep in mind is that not all employers have employee handbooks or employee manuals. Usually you have to be a fairly large employer before you have something like that. And so if you're a smaller place of employment, you may not have it. Another thing that's also important to keep in mind is that what's written down in a handbook may be the kind of word on high, but there's a lot of unofficial things that happen in a place of employment. So even when you have a handbook, it's smart to refer to it, but it's also smart to realize, yeah, but things sometimes actually happen differently than what's in the manual. Let me give you an example from my life. When I first graduated from law school, I went to work for a large law firm in Houston. Had a wonderful experience. It was a great place, but it was my first kind of real job, and so I didn't have a lot of a savvy about the corporate world. Anyway, one of the first things that I saw when I went through orientation is that I had 3 weeks of vacation time. And I was like, gosh, this is pretty crazy. I mean, most first jobs, maybe you don't even have a week that first year, and you certainly wouldn't expect to ever have more than 2 weeks your first year. And so it seemed fabulously generous. And so I was really kind of delighted by that. But I quickly discovered that, well, yes, we did all have 3 weeks. I mean, that was true. I could take 3 weeks. I could probably even take more than 3 weeks, and nobody would say anything to me. The reason why no one actually took 3 weeks, and in fact, lots of people didn't take any vacation, was because you had an amount of work that you had to accomplish during the year. You had a certain number of hours that you needed to bill, and in order to bill all that time, it was very, very difficult to do that and take off any meaningful vacation time. So yes, you could take that time off, but you were really going to pay for that through the rest of the year. And so as a result, very few employees took the 3 weeks, and it was an easy benefit for the employer to offer because the employer kind of knew, hey, wait a second, people aren't really going to be able to do this, and people who really did want to do it were going to meet their expectations by working super, super hard during the rest of the year. But again, nothing in the manual tells you about this particular wrinkle. You find out about it by sticking around and seeing how things work in the place. So keep in mind that a manual will give you some of the information, but you also need to observe, develop maybe a mentor-protege relationship with somebody so that you can kind of get the skinny on how things happen. I'll give you another example. An employee manual may well discuss what is appropriate attire in a workplace, but it may not cover that particular idea or that particular topic, or may not do a sufficiently complete job. But you want to observe how other people are dressed in that environment. And you also want to look and see, Okay, I'm currently in job A, but I'd like to move up to job B. Well, see how people in job B are dressed. It may be that people in your particular position, let's say you aspire to be the manager of the hotel, and right now you are a waiter or a waitress. The way that you're dressed as a waiter or waitress is perfectly appropriate. That's how all the other waiters and waitresses dress. But the managers dress differently. The managers dress in a more conservative, a more formal, a more business-like way. And so you may want to start thinking about dressing for the job that you want versus the job that you have. Again, that's not going to be covered in the manual. That's stuff you observe, and then you put that into effect. So don't think that the manual is going to cover everything you need to know. Okay, so let's assume that your place of employment does have a manual, and let's assume that you have some responsibility for maintaining it. One thing to keep in mind is that there are certain statutory things that have to be in manuals, in employee manuals. You're never required to have an employee manual, but if you choose to have a manual or choose to have a handbook, you have to have certain things in it. And so before you issue it, you need to have somebody who's expert in this particular area check your handbook to make sure you've dotted the I's and crossed the T's. That's one thing. You would also need to have it periodically reviewed by an attorney to make sure that there are no additional requirements. I'll give you an example. The Family and Medical Leave Act was passed in the 1990s, and it has very specific requirements for what has to go into the employee handbook if an employer has a handbook. But before that, the Family Medical Leave Act didn't exist, and so you wouldn't have known if you say published your handbook in say 1985, you wouldn't have known that you needed to have that language. You didn't at that point in time. And so let's say you revise your handbook every 5 years. Well, you don't need it in 1990 either to make any changes, but by 1995 you sure do need to make some changes. And so you need to know about this change in the statute. Well, I mean, the employment attorneys are going to know about it, but my guess is most hospitality managers have better ways to spend their weekends than catching up on employment law. And so you'll want to have an attorney update you about what you need to have in the manual, what's legally required if you're going to maintain that manual. As a baseline, you need to have FMLA, some FMLA stuff, and you need to have a statement about your EEO policy. This is that you don't discriminate, you offer equal opportunity. That's what it stands for, equal employment opportunity. That's what EEO stands for. And it's also a good idea. This is not legally required that you have an employment at will statement, but it certainly is smart, and I highly recommend that you include that. A fourth thing that you'll want to have, and this is not required, but it's highly recommended, is to have language in your manual and your handbook that says that this doesn't limit the ability of the employer to vary from it. So if you have, for example, a progressive disciplinary process, we'll talk more about this in a later a lecture on this topic, but if you have that established, there will be times where you decide not to follow it. But if you've stated it in your policy and you choose not to follow it, well, that can cause problems. Some judges might even say that there was an employment contract created when you established this policy, and now when you choose not to follow it, you may be in a difficult position. So you'll want to have language in your handbook or your manual that says, hey, we plan on following this most of the time, but there'll be times where it's not the right decision for us to make, and we're not bound to follow it. And so that language can be very, very helpful. So you want to talk about FMLA for sure. You'll want to talk about the EEO. You'll also want to talk about employment at will and your right to change and vary and make exceptions to the manual as you see fit. Okay, now we're going to flip over to workplace discrimination and sexual harassment. So let's talk first about prevention. We want to prevent these situations from rising. We want to prevent the situation from rising that causes the concern. We also want to prevent the complaint from arising. And so there's several things that we can do to reduce the likelihood. Now, we're never going to be able to get it to zero. There's always going to be some employees who interpret things through a certain lens and they're not going to be satisfied. There's no way that you can keep 100% of the people satisfied 100% of the time. I'm sure we've all had life experience enough to let us know about that. But there are strategies that we can do that are going to reduce the likelihood of people feeling that there is an unlawful motive for employment action that we're taking, and also that we can reduce the likelihood that the employee actually files a charge. So let's just refresh for a second about what are the categories that we can't discriminate. So we can't discriminate against people based upon their race or their color. And again, here we're talking about, I'm just going to talk in broad terms about race. We can't discriminate against someone because they are African American, because they are Chinese American or Japanese American or Korean American or Vietnamese American or Indian American. We can't discriminate against someone because they are Caucasian American. We can't discriminate against someone because they are Native American. We can't discriminate against someone because they are from any particular racial group. We also can't discriminate against people because of their pigmentation, either because they are light-skinned, dark-skinned, or any shade in between. We can't discriminate against people based upon their sex or their gender. So we can't prefer men to women, we can't prefer women to men. So we can't say, we only want men bartenders and we only want women waitresses. That's generally speaking not a lawful policy to have. In the hospitality industry, it's hard to imagine positions in which sex is a bona fide occupational qualification unless you're working, say, at a strip club or something like that. Hopefully, we won't have that situation arise. With respect to sex, there's a couple of carve-outs I think are worthy of discussion. One is pregnancy discrimination. We can't discriminate against, obviously this would be women, who are pregnant. And this can be related to the fact that they're pregnant or to the fact that they have complications relating to their pregnancy, or the fact that they have a miscarriage or have an abortion or give birth to a child. Now, there is no duty under this particular law to accommodate that pregnancy. You don't have to give somebody a light duty assignment because they're pregnant. I think that makes good sense. I'm not discouraging you from doing that, but there isn't a legal requirement under this statute that we're talking about right now. And we'll talk about other statutes later on in this area, so this answer is incomplete right now. But under Title VII, we don't have to affirmatively give accommodations for pregnancy-related absences, but we do need to not treat people who are pregnant disadvantageously. And then we'll talk about harassment in a little bit. That's another carve-out here. So we talked about race, color, sex. We also have national origin. In some respects, this is like race because obviously if you are an African American, you have ancestors who were from Africa at some point. You yourself may be from Africa. And so national origin can reflect the fact that certain nations, certain parts of the world, have different ethnicities, different races. But that doesn't always follow that there's a racial component to national origin. For example, I might be a French person who just doesn't like German people. Well, there's no argument that French people are a different race than German people. They're both Caucasian people, and neither one of them can look at each other and say, you look fundamentally different than I do. But there could still be a national origin issue here. Many times national origin issues come up when there is discrimination against someone because of the fact that they are Latino or Latina. Usually that is not considered a racial category, although certainly some people who are Latinos and Latinas see themselves as a part of a racial group. But others think of having that Latin connection as being distinct from race. And so it's possible to think of some people as being Afro-Hispanics, Caucasian Hispanics, Asian Hispanics, lots of different ways of looking at the issue of national origin. But this is another protected category. Then we also have religion. People have the right to have religious beliefs. They also have the right to be an agnostic or an atheist. And this is the first one where we have the employer has the duty to accommodate the religious observance. It could be that the person needs to wear certain clothes or be absent from work at certain times because of their religious obligations, and those need to be reasonably accommodated to the extent that they aren't an undue hardship. So these are the categories that we have under Title VII. Now let's go on and talk about the American Age Discrimination Employment Act, ADEA. And this obviously has to do with, age. And this is people who are 40 and older. People cannot be discriminated against because of their age once they've had their 40th birthday. And then we have the Americans with Disabilities Act, which has to do with, disability discrimination. And this is similar to the religion category in that there is the responsibility of the employer the responsibility of the employer to reasonably accommodate the disability. While the same language exists, both respect with religion and disability, the courts have interpreted the reasonable accommodation requirement under the Americans with Disabilities Act to be significantly more burdensome on employers than it has interpreted the religious portion. So these are the categories of discrimination that are not lawful. All of these categories can result in harassment. I can be harassed because of my race, because of my color, because of my sex, because of my national origin. Maybe there's only one R there. Yeah, sorry about that. Because of my religion, because of my age, because of my disability. All of these are subject or possibility of harassment. We oftentimes think about sexual harassment as being distinct from the other types of harassment. In many senses, it is, but they have a lot of similarities across the board. And so it's useful also to think about sexual harassment as a subcategory of the overall category of harassment. So being aware of these potential distinctions is half of the battle to avoid doing it. So when you're dealing with your subordinates, be sure to be consistent. If you give George a disciplinary action because he's been tardy, but you don't address that same issue with Bob, even though Bob has been as tardy as much as George, you are not being consistent. You're likely going to cause hard feelings between Bob and George. And if Bob and George are of a different race or different religion or different national origin or different age or different disability status, you very likely have opened yourself up to some type of discrimination charge, even if that wasn't at all your thinking or what you at least were consciously aware of when you made those decisions. And so be aware of the dynamics, and when you're making a decision, pause and think, wait a second, am I treating people of this race the same as I'm treating people of that race? Am I treating people of this gender the same as I'm treating people of that gender? An issue that comes up in the hospitality industry, especially in Texas, is the fact that many of the workers in the hospitality industry may be bilingual, or in fact, they may just be speakers only, not even of English, but of a different language. For example, they may be Spanish speakers. Even if the individuals are fluent in English, they may feel more comfortable speaking Spanish. And so you need to have a policy, maybe you don't state it, but at least an idea of what your position is going to be with respect to the use of Spanish. Let's talk about some of the legal issues that arise in this area. The EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, is a federal agency that administers all of these statutes that we've been talking about here. And its position is that an employer cannot stop or prohibit or punish workers who choose to speak a language other than English when it does not negatively impact the employer's business. And the vast majority of times there isn't going to be that impact. So for example, if the employees are in the break room hanging out together, they're not on the clock, they're not working, and they choose to speak Spanish or Vietnamese or Serbo-Croatian, whatever language they want to speak, the employer doesn't really have a reason to monitor that use of language or to tell the individuals what to speak. That's what the rule is. But it's also important to keep in mind some of the other issues in play here. Let's assume that that break room is shared with many employees, and some of those employees may not be fluent. We'll just say the alternative language is Spanish. Those other workers may not be fluent in Spanish. In fact, they may walk into the room and hear their colleagues speaking in a language that they don't understand, and they may assume, correctly or incorrectly, that they are being talked about, or that at least there's the possibility that they're being talked about, and that can make the person feel quite uncomfortable. And so it's a good idea to let everybody know kind of these dynamics in the situation. Let the English only speakers know, wait a second, these people are just trying to hang out during their break time and speak the language that they're more comfortable speaking, just like you want to speak the language you're more comfortable speaking. It's also a good idea to let the people speak a different language to understand that the people who are a little bit uncomfortable with the Spanish aren't saying that because they don't like Spanish language, but because they are a little bit feel left out. That's just kind of the nature of that thing. And so oftentimes when people are kind of allowed to share their feelings, some kind of accommodation can be worked out. The times where the employer can require English are typically twofold. One, when it directly impacts the business. So for example, if I am the waitress and I approach a table and start speaking Spanish to the people at the table, but the people at the table don't speak Spanish, those customers, those guests may feel uncomfortable. They may feel unwelcome being approached in that manner, and that would be an appropriate reaction for the restaurant to want to avoid. And so it's pretty common for hospitality industry to have a policy that says you need to approach customers or clients or guests, depending upon the particular hospitality industry you're involved in English first, and then you can ask if they would prefer a different language and then move to that different language, as opposed to making assumptions about what language that person prefers. Now, this might be a repeat customer that you know, hey, I speak Spanish, this family I was at this restaurant last week, they preferred Spanish. There's no reason to go through that same script every time, but to approach folks at least that initial time in English is probably a good idea. So that can be a way to approach the English-only circumstance. Another way can be in safety times. When there is some situation that might come up, a fire in the kitchen, perhaps a disgruntled customer who is maybe too drunk and maybe is causing a bit of a ruckus, those types of situations. You want to make sure everyone understands what to do and how to handle it, and who needs to call the police and who needs to get customers to a safe area. And so under those circumstances, it makes sense to use English only so that everybody is sure about exactly what's happening. And so having everyone trained to understand certain terms, even if English isn't their first language, can help facilitate that situation. Another issue that's important is that while I was talking about consistent treatment earlier, and that certainly is an important idea, we don't want to get too lockstep. We don't want to ignore the fact that our employees are human beings. They're individuals. They have different life circumstances. So, for example, you might have a long service employee, someone who's been with you 10 years, who's had great attendance for 10 years, very few tardies, almost no absences. And she's hit some challenges. Her husband has left her. She's got some children. It's very difficult to get them all to school on time because of the logistics of getting that all done. And now she's a single parent, and she's having some difficulty making that adjustment. Imagine at the same time that you've just hired somebody, he doesn't have any track record with you, and he doesn't seem to have any excuse for why he's been late. He's still in his probationary period. You might say, well, the same treatment would be to fire both of them, but I don't think under those circumstances that would be a reasonable approach, and I don't think you'd have to worry about, from a compliance standpoint, treating those individuals differently. Differences such as the reason for the absence or the tardies, and also the length of service and the fact that this is a new problem that you're expecting will be eventually worked out more smoothly, can cause you to treat people fairly but not identically. Of course, when you do decide to treat one person differently than another, you need to think through, hey, How can this be misinterpreted? How am I going to justify this if I get challenged? So it's certainly something that is worthy of some reflection before you make that decision, but it's not always a bad call for you to treat people fairly instead of identically. We're going to continue on and talk about sexual harassment and also harassment more generally in more detail, and we'll also talk about the topic of employer liability. Here we go. Let me clear this out. Okay, there are two categories of sexual harassment. The first is quid pro quo. This category is the category of sexual harassment that is unique to sexual harassment. It's a category of harassment that's unique to sexual harassment. You don't see quid pro quo in racial harassment cases or national origin harassment cases or religious harassment cases or age harassment cases. You only see quid pro quo in sexual harassment cases. The second category, the hostile work environment, we see this one in all of those cases. So this is unique to sexual harassment. And this one applies to all harassment categories. Okay, so let's talk about quid pro quo. Literally, quid pro quo means this for that. It's a classic language that we see in contract law. Quid pro quo means your consideration in exchange for my consideration. I mean, that's the heart of the employment relationship. If I don't go to work, I don't get paid. My quid is my labor. My quo is my paycheck. So there's nothing inherently wrong with quid pro quo, this for that. I give you this, you give me that. But of course, in the sexual harassment scenario, there is something deeply, deeply, deeply wrong with it. And this is that same idea. So quid pro quo we see is the quid being some type of sexual favor that is required in order for that person to get some kind of goodie or to avoid some bad effect. So examples of quid pro quo could be date me or I'll fire you. Kiss me and I'll give you the promotion. Have sex with me and you won't be on the layoff list. Those types of things. Those statements are clearly unlawful, and they are kind of the classic examples that we think of as sexual harassment. They certainly happen today, clearly happen today, but I think the more common category, the less absolutely shocking category perhaps, is the hostile work environment. This one is a little bit more subtle. It is equally an example of sexual harassment, and again, this is the category of harassment that applies to all those other types of discrimination. So this exists, and I actually lifted this definition from the EEOC website. When the harassing conduct is severe or pervasive enough to create a work environment that a reasonable person would consider intimidating, hostile, or abusive. There's lots of things to unpack here. Usually a single episode of harassing behavior is not going to meet this hurdle unless it's really extreme. So for example, a single dirty joke, a single use of a racially insensitive term, a single action or something like that, in most cases is not going to meet this hurdle unless it's very, very wrong. So for example, while a single dirty joke isn't going to be sufficient for a hostile environment, grabbing somebody that could easily, probably not a back rub or a touch on the back or something, but a sexually motivated touching could be, that one incident could be enough to push us over into the hostile environment. In the racial area, something like a noose on somebody's desk or threats of a racial component could be sufficient, even though there's just one of those events. The standard isn't what the victim of the harassment thinks was intimidating or hostile or abusive. Let me just give you an example. Imagine that I am from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I'm Amish. I've lived my entire life on a farm in Amish country. I've never seen television. I've never read modern fiction. I don't have any internet experience. I've always worn my hair in a bun, and I've always worn long dresses. I leave my family for a period of time to go to the big city to earn some money, and I go to work in a warehouse. The people who work in this warehouse are a little bit more salty than anything I've ever been exposed to. They tell some dirty jokes sometimes. They have some pictures up on the wall of scantily clothed, people. They engage in behavior that I consider shocking, and I'm just pretty blown away by it. And I'm a reasonable person. I'm not a person that has poor judgment generally in life, but my life experience is so different than the typical Americans that the fact that I find that work environment abusive or hostile or intimidating isn't going to be the measuring stick that the court's going to apply. It's not the reasonable Amish person standard. It's the reasonable generic American standard. And while maybe the average American wouldn't particularly enjoy that environment, it may not be so severe or so pervasive that the average American person would find it intimidating, hostile, or abusive. So we don't look at it through the eyes of that reasonable person, the Amish person, the person that maybe was a victim of some type of sexual abuse, or the person who has been the victim of racial epithets in the past and is very sensitive to those types of things. Now we look at it from that reasonable person, that kind of average American person. How would he or she have viewed that circumstance? And if that person would find it intimidating or hostile or abusive to the extent that it negatively impacts that person's ability to be successful at work, that's when we have a hostile work environment. So the bar is probably higher than most people think it is with sexual harassment. Most employers, even though the bar is relatively high on this, lots of things that are offensive and gross and uncomfortable and inappropriate don't meet the threshold of sexual harassment or other types of harassment. Even though the bar for the law is relatively high, that doesn't mean that employers want to permit behavior that's just a little bit less than sexual harassment, because obviously these types of behaviors, even if they don't meet the legal definition of sexual harassment, are certainly not helpful to the work environment, and they certainly can take, for one thing, they take away time from people being productive, number one, and number two, they can result in tense and difficult working relationships between people, and can cause people to quit, to call off from work because they say they're sick, all kinds of negative things. So employers sometimes aren't so concerned with whether this behavior meets the definition of sexual harassment, but their concern may instead be, is this behavior stuff we want to have in our workplace? Maybe it does or doesn't meet sexual harassment, but do we want our workers to treat each other this way? And the answer may well be, no, we don't like this, even though it may be significantly less severe than we think qualifies as harassment. Okay, let me talk a little bit more. So when we're talking about harassment, and again, this is all the types of harassment, an important thing for employers to do is to train their workers. Typically, employers do this through looking at videos. They can have presentations too that can make sense. A lot of times these also can be computer-based training where the employee clicks through screens and answers questions, things along those lines. Those can be very helpful ways of doing several things. One thing that they can do is educate employees. Can educate employees about how not to behave with respect to their coworkers.
this is especially useful for somebody who's just entering the workplace, who may not know where the line of appropriate behavior is. It can also educate people who might be victims of harassment. Many times saying, hey, I don't really appreciate that kind of humor, once is all that you need to do to solve the problem. It's when that particular employee doesn't complain or doesn't express concerns that the situation escalates, and at some point then something needs to be, there needs to be a bigger solution to something that could have been much smaller. So educating potential people who don't like that kind of stuff, hey, you don't have to put up with it even that first time. And also letting them know how they can make a complaint, what that process looks like in your organization, and how that person will be treated. That person will be treated with respect and courtesy. That person won't be subject to any kind of retaliation. All of those things you'll want to make sure that you're communicating clearly to the potential victims. You'll also want to explain what that process looks like. Who should that victim go to? And you want to have at least 2 different people that person can go to, because if you say go to your manager, well, what if it's the manager who is harassing the person? They can't very well go to the person who is harassing them and saying, hey, I'm filing a complaint against you because you're harassing me. That's not going to be a very effective mechanism. So you'll typically want to have at least 2 people. If you're part of a larger organization that has multiple locations, you're probably going to want to have one within the facility and one outside the facility. You'll want to have a prompt investigation. Now, you may well from time to time be called upon to conduct the investigation. Here's some things to keep in mind as you do the investigation. One thing you'll want to do is you'll want to thank the person who's come forward. You'll want to get their statement, ask lots of questions, get them to provide all the specifics, all the details. Sometimes they may have confirming information, for example, emails or texts or pictures or things like that. You'll also want to get ideas from them about who ought to be interviewed, people who may have overheard things or seen things in the workplace. After you've interviewed we'll call the person the victim, although you haven't really decided that there's been anything wrong at this point, then you'll want to talk to some of the other witnesses and potentially, or certainly eventually, you'll want to talk to the person who's being accused of this behavior. You'll want to do this as quickly as possible, because in this interim period of time, the situation can escalate pretty quickly. If you expect that you're not going to be able to complete the whole process in a very short period of time, you'll want to alert the potential harasser to stay clear of the alleged victim at this point. They really ought not be interacting with each other at all during the course of the investigation. Now, this can be tricky because you don't want to retaliate against the person who's made the complaint. So you definitely don't want to send that person home and say, well, you know, you're scheduled to work the same shift as the other person that you're complaining about, so I don't want you two having an issue, so you need to go home and we're not going to pay you for it. Well, that's retaliation for making the complaint. Now, you can send the person home with pay. That can be an approach, especially if the victim likes that solution. But if they like the solution, I recommend that you document that. They say, yes, they are happy with the idea of being sent home with pay for this particular issue. If this person is a waiter or a waitress, you know, they may be foregoing tips or things like that you may want to think about how you're going to handle that issue. You also don't really ideally want to send the alleged harasser home, because at this point you don't know that they've done anything wrong. We don't usually like to punish people until we've been able to investigate it. You might, under certain circumstances, want to send that person home, again, with pay so that the matter can be addressed more clearly, but that's sending a signal to the workforce, hey, this person is in trouble or something. And at this point, you really don't want to send that signal necessarily. So ideally, you want them to continue to work, but insofar as you can, get them separated. If they are, say, one is busing tables, one is waiting tables, you may want to move one of them to a different part of the restaurant so they're not necessarily going to be super close to one another, for example, to the extent that can happen. Maybe you can switch up their schedules. Bob usually works on Tuesday nights. Mary usually works on Tuesday nights. Maybe you can move one of them to another day. Again, working with them, would it be okay if you worked Wednesday instead? Oh, yeah, sure, that's fine. Okay, that type of thing, working out to the extent that you can. After you've completed your investigation, you're going to want to reach findings. You're never going to know exactly what happened. That's okay. You're doing the best that you can. And obviously, it's very likely that you will hear two different stories. It's pretty unlikely that the harasser is going to say, yep, I did it all. Yep, exactly what that person said. That's exactly what I did. The harasser, we'll call the harasser Mary in this case. Mary may be telling absolutely 100% of the truth, and Bob may be absolutely lying when he says he didn't do it. It's also possible it's the other way around. Mary could be absolutely lying, and Bob could be telling 100% of the truth. Or it could be something in between. Mary's telling part of the truth, maybe not the whole truth. Bob's telling part of the truth, maybe not the whole truth. Will you ever know for sure what happened? Probably not. But you are empowered or directed to figure out as much as you can. So you're going to look for things like other witnesses, how credible those two witnesses are, also what their history is. What do you know about these two people? You probably have a context to have an opinion about them going into this. And looking for any, especially independent documentation that might support or contradict their messages. So you're going to reach some conclusions about what happened. When you reach the conclusions, then you're going to make a recommendation as to what ought to happen next. Again, we can never retaliate against the victim. They've made this complaint. I suppose if you come up with smoking gun evidence that they absolutely lied, there's a video that shows it happened completely differently, and there's just no way of reconciling what they told you to what actually happened. I suppose there's a possibility of having really just that clear misstatement, and you might then say, okay, well, with this smoking gun evidence, we're going to go ahead and take disciplinary action against you, the person who made the complaint. But short of that, which will probably never happen, you aren't going to take any disciplinary action against the person making the complaint. That's going to be the case even when you don't really believe that person, even when you have grave doubts as to their truthfulness. But the person who has been accused, you may do a variety of things. One thing you may do is you may conclude that he or she behaved just fine. Bob didn't really do anything wrong. That's your conclusion. Well, then you're not going to take disciplinary action against Bob. Under those circumstances, you're going to probably require that Bob and also possibly Mary separately go through some kind of a refresher on sexual harassment. You may even have the whole department go through that if there's been some indication that it's not just Bob, but it's a variety of people. Many times that happens in the work environment, that it's not just one person who stepped the line, it's that the line has become eroded over time, and Bob's actions may have been going just a little bit farther than everybody else's, but everyone probably needs a reminder. You may find that what Bob did was out of line, really wasn't appropriate, but either it wasn't sufficiently serious that you think dismissal is appropriate, or you think that Mary's behavior contributed to the situation in some way, or perhaps Bob is just a very long service person and you really feel like because he hasn't been warned about his past, you want to give him another chance. So it doesn't always result, sexual harassment doesn't always result in termination. But once you've had a finding that someone is sexually harassed and you retain them, you own them. And by that I mean is if they make another misstep, it's very, very difficult for you to not have liability from that person who is claiming sexual harassment the second time. So you have to monitor that situation very, very closely for many, many months, and probably regularly touch base with Mary, probably regularly touch base with Bob, reminding Bob, don't do that, and also making sure that Bob isn't hitting on another person in the work environment. So the discipline doesn't have to be termination. It could be scheduling Bob into a shift there is more supervision. It could be disciplinary suspension. It could be a demotion where he doesn't have supervisory responsibility. It could be lots of different things. Now, just separating Bob and Mary, especially when you're not changing Mary's schedule or reducing her hours, has an appeal, but it's not necessarily the complete solution, because Bob may start harassing somebody else. It may not just be strictly focused upon Mary. So be aware that even when you separate the two, you still need to monitor Bob's behavior going forward. Then, of course, sometimes your decision is going to be that Bob needs to go. Either this is the second time that's happened or it was especially egregious circumstances. When you do that, you need to be aware of the fact that Bob may well file a charge against you alleging sex discrimination, that he's being treated differently because he's a male, or if you were a female who Bobby, who's allegedly harassing, maybe you were holding women up to a higher standard than men, or whatever the circumstances are going to be. It's pretty common in those situations to get a charge. If you don't fire Bob or don't give Bob pretty significant discipline, it may be Mary who's filing a charge. It's a pretty common thing to happen in these cases. So it's important to consider those decisions as you're building up your documentation. Not all employers are able to afford or are willing to afford the services of an attorney to help you manage this process. But you definitely are going to want to have some support from HR. And if it involves a senior person within your organization, you will want to have an attorney to assist you in this process. You'll want to document all this very, very clearly so that both the training that all of your workers go through periodically and all the parts of your investigation. The paper trail is really, really important in this situation. One of the reasons, by the way, you want to document the sexual harassment training isn't just to paper the file, but it can be very important if you actually do get a sexual harassment lawsuit at some point. Because when you can prove that you've trained the individuals, then that is likely to reduce your liability. And that's especially important if the victim doesn't file a complaint as promptly as he or she should. Because the idea is, well, you told the person what to do. You told them when they had this type of concern they needed to follow these steps, and this person didn't do it. How is that your fault? And so that's a powerful piece of evidence that you want to make sure that you're developing. You don't know who's going to file a charge of discrimination. You have to work with the assumption that it could be anyone in your organization, so you need to have that paper trail, and you need to retain it going forward. Okay, so we've talked about sexual harassment categories. Let's talk about vicarious liability. A vicarious liability, the definition here is a party's responsibility for the acts of another which result in injury, harm, or damage. When we use this term in the law, we oftentimes are referring to the employee-employer relationship. Let's say that you work for Red Lobster. Well, Red Lobster is not a human being. You probably already knew that, right? It's a corporation. A corporation can't do anything. It's a legal fiction. The only way that Red Lobster can do anything is when one of its employees signs a contract, takes an action, hires somebody, fires somebody, harasses somebody, signs a contract, whatever the action is, it's done by a human being, by an employee or an independent contractor of Red Lobster. And through those actions of its employees, Red Lobster becomes liable. It can be a good thing. You might be the manager of a Red Lobster and you hire the best waiter ever. And as a result of him being your employee, you find that your sales increase because he's really good at generating add-on sales and really getting people to buy the more expensive items on the menu, and he can be very efficient and handle lots of tables and all that good stuff. And so the company, Red Lobster, benefits significantly because of the wisdom of your hiring choice. But on the other hand, if you hire somebody bad who's stealing from the business, who insults lots of customers and makes customers decide not to return, that obviously is a detriment to your business. So Red Lobster is now poorer as a result of that poor decision. Well, the same idea exists in liability. If I hire somebody and that person makes a bad decision, well, the repercussions of that bad decision will be borne by the employer, by the company that I work for. So if I hire Bob and Bob sexually harasses Mary, yeah, she's going to sue Bob, but she's also going to sue the employer that she and Bob have. Say, hey, the employer shouldn't have hired Bob in the first place, or the employer should have trained Bob better so he didn't engage in this behavior, or the employer should have been aware of the harassment and ended it earlier. And so there can be several different ways that Mary will present that the employer ought to be liable. But it's a pretty common argument. And the reality is that Bob probably isn't a wealthy person. And so therefore, Mary isn't really looking to sue Bob in the hopes of getting a lot of money. It's typically the employer that's a deep pocket that has significant resources. So when is the employer responsible for Bob's harassment? This is a really complicated issue and kind of beyond the scope of this course to talk about. There are some times when an employer is not responsible for the harassment that one of its employees has committed. But a good rule of thumb for employers to assume is if there's harassment going on, the employer is going to be liable. And as a result, that should be the set of assumptions. Yes, there will be some legal arguments sometimes made that may diminish or even remove the employer's liability, but you ought to work under the assumption that that liability is going to exist in harassment cases. Okay, we've kind of already covered a lot of this, but here's a little refresher. Okay, so we're going to train our employees and the managers to avoid harassment, things like don't talk about these topics, to identify it so that people can say, hey, I'm being harassed, or I'm seeing other people being harassed, and to explain how to report that behavior. And you're going to document that training carefully, and you're also going to document any reports that you get. When you do get a complaint, you're going to promptly and thoroughly investigate it. You're not going to retaliate in any way against the accuser, and you are going to document every step of the investigation. You aren't going, this is something that the textbook talks about, and I don't really agree with this portion, as probably you've heard me talk about in other lectures. I practiced employment law for about 20 years, and a very almost automatic thing that employment lawyers will say is that once an accuser says that there are complaints about sexual harassment, even if it's just kind of an off-the-cuff comment, they can't unsay it. They can't opt out. The investigation has to go forward. Employment lawyers have that philosophy for a few reasons. For one thing, if Mary thinks there's harassment going on, then we need to stop it, not just for Mary's benefit, but for the whole department's benefit, because Bob may be harassing somebody else, or even if he stops harassing Mary, he may start harassing another person. And so we can't let Mary opt out because there may be other people affected. Number one. Number two, if we let Mary opt out and then the harassment continues and Mary files a lawsuit, well, I can promise you that the courts will allow Mary to continue that lawsuit, and part of the reason will be, well, you knew about the harassment, you didn't investigate it. And so counting on Mary to remain consistent in her decision not to investigate is just not likely. After all, she told you for a reason, and now she wants to back out. Well, who's to say in the future she won't come back and say, well, you should have investigated after all. You shouldn't have listened to me when I said you want to back out. Or she might even dispute that she ever said she wanted to opt out. I know the textbook suggests that you have some kind of form that the person can make that will give him or her the right to opt out. I'm not going to say that there's never a circumstance that you might not want to follow that course of action, but I would highly, highly recommend you not to follow that kind of action unless you've gotten the advice of an attorney. Okay, you'll want to reach findings, and again, you don't want to there's a temptation to be kind of mealy-mouthed, because again, you're going to have conflicting recollections, and you're not going to know exactly what happened. And so you are going to want to couch your findings with some wiggle room. But you're also going to want to reach some conclusions. You shouldn't just say, well, I don't know. I mean, Mary says this and Bob says this and I don't know. No, you do need to reach some credibility determinations. You don't have to say, I'm 1,000% sure it happened exactly this way, but you do need to say, you know, based upon my review or my interview of the witnesses and my review of the documentation, I believe X happened. And so you do need to reach some findings, and you need to you may not be the decision maker, but if you're not the decision maker, you need to make a recommendation as what ought to happen. And this can be informed by what the company has done in the past with harassment concerns. Some employers are very inclined to dismiss people under those circumstances. Some employers are more likely to give people a second chance. That's a helpful piece of information to have as you're deciding what to do. An issue that happens sometimes in hospitality businesses is the third-party harassment. It's the customer who harasses, the person who the person at the restaurant who's had a few too many drinks, and he starts or she starts grabbing at the waiters or waitresses, telling off-color jokes or things like that, or racially offensive jokes, all that kind of stuff. How do you handle that? Well, the fact is that the customer is not always right, and it's not okay for customers to harass employees, and employers, managers need to stop that behavior and to protect their employees. They need to do that because of legal liability, but they also need to do it because it's the right thing to do, and your employees are watching. And if you don't treat your employees with the respect that they are entitled to, you're going to find that your workers are going to be less committed to working in your environment, and it's going to, in the long run, be a negative, and it's going to ultimately result in poorer customer service. You're trying to preserve the customer service by treating that customer who's behaving poorly as if he's not, and that's not in your long-term interest. Now, that doesn't mean that the first time a customer winks at the waitress, you automatically says, "Out of here, buddy." But you do need to be aware of customers who've had a problem in this area, and maybe make sure that they are sent to an area where there may be fewer temptations or fewer situations along those lines. And you need to make sure that when it's crossing a line, that the employer, that the customer knows that you aren't going to put up with that kind of stuff. Another category or another issue to talk about is employer's liability insurance. You're probably not going to get involved in making the decision about whether your company buys liability insurance under the situation. This type of insurance is a complex call. You're probably the CFO of your company is probably going to be involved in making these decisions, also the general counsel, if there's a general counsel in your organization. This type of insurance can be expensive, and even when the employer has this type of insurance, it is not by any means a complete protection, because harassment and things like that are intentional acts, and these types of policies usually don't cover intentional acts, at least not completely. And so it's something to consider. It's something to educate yourself about if that's part of your job responsibility. But there's not an automatic yes or an automatic no to whether this is a good choice for your organization or not. Let's talk about the Family Medical Leave Act, which is commonly called FMLA. The first thing to keep in mind is this is an incredibly complex statute. Let me put it this way. My area, one of my areas of responsibilities when I was at JCPenney was that I was the FMLA compliance person for the organization, and we worked very, very hard to have a very high level of compliance, and I'm quite proud of the level of compliance that we were able to achieve. It's pretty rare to find a corporation that has a very high level of compliance in this area, because it is such a demanding statute. It requires so much paperwork with very short time periods. It is very difficult to fully comply with this law. And honestly, it's unlikely that you will achieve a very high level of compliance. It's very complex, and so more than anything else, we're going to talk about some of the aspects of the law, but more than anything else, it's important to keep in mind that you need to defer to your legal department and to your HR department for the details. I could spend 4 or 5 weeks talking about this, and we still wouldn't get you to the point that you were an expert in this particular statute. I'm just kind of introducing you to some topics. Here's what I'm going to do. So the first thing is, the FMLA does not apply to all employers. When we were talking about employment discrimination earlier, I didn't even talk about the threshold, the number of employees that you had to have for it to be covered. But very small employers are not covered by the discrimination statutes. So there are some very small entities that don't have to even comply with the no racial harassment, no sex discrimination, no religious discrimination type protections. But you're probably not going to work for those for very long unless you are starting up your own restaurant or something like that. But it is entirely possible that you will work for an entity that is not covered by the Family and Medical Leave Act, because they have to have, and again, there's a pretty sophisticated equation for all of this, but they have to have 50 employees. And again, if you're close to 50, either side of it, it's useful to go through the details of the statute to make sure it really applies to you. But if you only have 20 employees, you're not covered. If you have 70 or 80 employees, you're almost certainly covered. So, and it's not just necessarily one location, although that adds another complication to the situation. So if you have, let's say you're managing a string of subways. Each one of the subways maybe only has a staff of 10 or 15 people, but you happen to be responsible for 8 of them in the area. Does FMLA apply or not? Probably it does, but it might not. It's going to depend upon how close they are geographically to one another and other issues. So you'll want to do a deeper dive beyond the scope of this class to get through the details, but just think in terms of 50 and what side of that you're on. Another thing is that, you know, while our first issue is, are we a covered employer? The next issue is a particular employee a covered employee? And this is a fairly complex issue, but there's some things that we're looking for here. First of all, has this employee worked for you for at least 12 months? Most of the time, this is going to be pretty easy to calculate because you're looking for the last 12 months. And if they've been here for the last 12 months, then guess what? They've been here 12 months. That's pretty straightforward. But sometimes you'll have employees who have worked for you in the past and are returning to work for you. In that situation, you'll need to add up all of the service they had. The 3 months 7 years ago, followed by the 2 months 2 years ago, followed by the 10 months that they've had more recently. You'll need to add up all of that time to see whether they meet this 1 year service requirement. Sometimes your records aren't going to be that good in this area, and so you'll have to kind of do some deep dive, deep digging to figure out exactly what days they worked during that previous time. Another thing is that they have to have worked 1,250 hours in the last year. This one, we're just looking at the last 365 days. We're not going back over their entire lifetime to figure this out. As a result, people who are truly part-time, 20 hours a week people, they oftentimes are not covered by FMLA. So a person could have worked for you the last 12 months throughout that whole period, but they only averaged 20 hours a week. Well, under those circumstances, they probably have about 1,000 to 1,100 hours. And so they have not worked enough to reach that 1,250 eligibility. Let's imagine a different scenario, though. This time you have a full-time employee. She's worked for you for the last 5 months. 7 years ago, she worked for you for 10 months. So she meets this first requirement that she has a total of a year of service for you. But she probably doesn't meet that 1,250 hours since she's only recently worked for you for the last 5 months. Even at 40 hours a week, even at more than 40 hours a week, she's probably going to be below that 1,250 threshold. But you may want to crunch some numbers to see which side of the line she's going to be on. Another thing to consider is whether we have a covered event. So we first of all consider, are we a covered employer? Then we consider the employee. Is this employee a covered employee? And then the last issue that we're going to look at, maybe not the last issue, but the third issue is the event that is the reason for the request a covered event? And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But let me just flag a couple of issues for you. First of all, is that, you know, the classic circumstance that people think about in this area is, you know, somebody's had a heart attack or they've had a baby. And so they need an extended period of time off work, maybe several weeks. That's a classic example, and certainly that is a valid FMLA situation. But that's not the most common. The most common way that FMLA happens is in much more small increments. It could be just a few hours. That can be an FMLA event. In fact, whatever the time unit that your particular employer uses to record time, and many times people record it in units of 6 minutes or even 1 minute or 15-minute increments. Whatever that is, that's that time period, whatever the time clock uses, is the time increment that a person can use for FMLA. So let's say that I am going through chemotherapy and I need to leave work early 2 hours every other Tuesday. Well, guess what? That's an FMLA event. I can't be required to take off more than those 2 hours, but I can't be required not to take off that time. Now, I, as the employee, do have a responsibility to try to schedule my time in a way that won't conflict with my work schedule. So let's say I don't work on Wednesdays. If I can switch my chemotherapy time to Wednesdays, then I ought to do that. But many times that's not going to be possible. And it's best not to challenge an employee who says, nope, can't change, it's got to be on this time, and go ahead and allow that employee to take that time off. Many FMLA events are just short time things. It's bronchitis that I need to have 5 days off work. It doesn't seem like a big illness, but it meets the definition of FMLA, and that person would need to have that time off to recover from that particular diagnosis. One thing to keep in mind when you're dealing with FMLA is that once the person becomes eligible, once they've been in your employ for a year, becomes very difficult for an employer to address attendance problems that are illness related. If you have somebody who seems to be missing a lot of work or arriving work late, and they have had that first year anniversary, especially if they are saying it is health related, you are not going to be able to terminate or to discipline the person in a lawful manner. Very unlikely you'll be able to do that. The Americans with Disabilities Act already makes it difficult to do that, even during that first year of service, because one way to reasonably accommodate a disability can be being more flexible about attendance. But the disability bar is pretty high. In order to demonstrate a person is disabled, they have to have a serious health condition that substantially limits a major life activity. The definition for what is covered under the Family Medical Leave Act is significantly lower hurdle. And so therefore, once the person has that first year anniversary, it's much more likely they will be covered by FMLA than they were covered by the ADA. You may recall before in this presentation I talked about pregnancy discrimination. I said how we don't have under the law a requirement under the Pregnancy Discrimination Act to reasonably accommodate that pregnancy-related condition. So there's no obligation, for example, to give a pregnant woman who has a medical restriction some kind of light duty assignment. And that's true. The Pregnancy Discrimination Act does not require that, although I would submit to you that's a good idea. I think that makes a lot of sense for most circumstances. But the Family Medical Leave Act does require accommodation in many circumstances. And so you'll want to consider how those fit together with respect to that. The Family Medical Leave doesn't require accommodation, but it can certainly be a smart strategy under the FMLA. So I kind of misspoke when I said the accommodation is required, but it is definitely something to think about when you are exploring how to assist somebody who has pregnancy. And certainly, probably the biggest issue with pregnancy discrimination is when an employer refuses to accommodate somebody who is having pregnancy-related complications that require them to take time off from work. Again, the Pregnancy Discrimination Act doesn't require that the employer accommodate those if the employer does not ordinarily accommodate illnesses. But if that person is FMLA eligible, then of course the employer is required to accommodate those types of situations. So keep in mind, if you have an employee that you feel like is not having a good attendance situation,
You need to address that in that first year if you can lawfully address it in the first year. Okay, so let's talk about the circumstances under which we can have an covered event. One is for the birth of a child or to care for a newborn child within that first year of the birth. And this applies to both mom and dad. Both individuals are entitled to spend time with the child, and also initially at the birth and also throughout that first year of employment. Now, the employer can require that that be done all in one lump sum if that's what the employer prefers. But the employer can work out some kind of alternative plan if that makes sense. So it might be a reduced schedule for the first 6 months instead of 3 complete months off through 12 weeks off. Maybe the parent will want to work a reduced schedule during 4 or 5 months. That can be a good way of approaching that situation. But again, it has to be by agreement of both the employer and the employee. In addition to the situation of birth, adoptions and foster care placements also give the new mom and dad the ability to take off time. This may be a little bit less intuitive because usually when there's a birth of a child, that child isn't able to immediately go into daycare, and the mom typically has some recovery time where she's not able to return to work because of her own medical circumstance. But when you're adopting a child, especially an older child, there may not be any problem with putting that child immediately into school or some kind of a daycare situation. And of course, there's no recovery time for adoption. But still, that situation does provide for 12 weeks of time. And again, the idea here is bonding for that child with the parents. Finally, when or not finally, but an employee can have his or her own serious health condition. That means that during that period of time, the employee can't perform the essential functions of his or her job. We'll talk more about what we mean by serious health condition in a little bit, but just flag this term right now so that we can talk about it a little bit later. But it's not restricted just to the employee's serious health condition, because again, we have the word family in this term. It also applies to when the employee's spouse is sick, when the employee's child is sick, or when the employee's parent is sick. Now, this is a very limited category of people. So, for example, I can't claim FMLA to care for my mother-in-law. I can't claim it to care for my stepdad. I can't claim it to care for my grandchild. I can't even claim it to care for my adult child in most cases. So there's not a lot of people who can claim, for whom I can claim this protection. And then finally we have this category. This category actually came up in the law quite a bit after the initial statute came out. And this is designed to protect people whose family member is a military member having an exigent circumstance. It's a very broad category. If you happen to get this request, you would be well advised to contact an attorney to see exactly what your obligations are under those circumstances. They're much more generous and much more broad than we see with the FMLA statute. One thing to keep in mind with the FMLA is that the worker gets 12 weeks, but if an employee has more than one FMLA incident, it's not that he gets a second 12-week allotment. 12 weeks is all he or she will get. So if I've given birth to a child in January and I take up my 12 weeks and I break my leg in June, I don't get another 12 weeks. Now, of course, the fact that I don't have an FMLA protection doesn't mean the employer can't work with me and can't continue my employment. It just means that this particular statute doesn't apply to my particular circumstances. So I'm going to now show you a resource. Just get out of here for a second and I'll show you where to find it. So we're going to go to our class website. Wait a second. Here we go. So if we go to modules and go to week 8 and go to the assignment, Chapter 8 assignment, Family and Medical Leave Act scenarios. There is a link in here.
here we go. If you click on this link, this will open up. So we're going to go to this document. This is helpful for you in mastering the family, or not mastering, but becoming familiar with the Family Medical Leave Act. It is also relevant to your mastery of the assignment, these 4 scenarios. So I'm going to spend a little time pointing you in the right direction so that you can have a lot of success on this particular assignment, and also so you can be prepared for the test that's going to come up. So we already talked about the first question that we're going to think about is, are we a covered employer? And so let's see how we're going to use this material to help us find out that information. As you can see here, there's a table of contents. And you can see under Chapter 1, we have a category called Covered Employers. So I'm going to go to page 9 to find that particular information. I said before, the only thing that I'm going to hold you responsible for knowing is, here we go, is this section right here. Let me just go ahead and annotate. Here we go. Is this right here. A private sector employer is covered by the FMLA if it employs 50 or more employees. That's all I'm going to expect that you know. Certainly you can know more. That's not a bad thing at all, but that's what I am going to ask that you be familiar with. And that's all you need to know for this assignment. In fact, you don't even need to know that, because you should assume for the assignment that the employer for whom you work is covered by the FMLA, or there isn't much of an assignment, right? Okay, so let's go to the next issue that we're concerned about, and that is whether our employee is covered. So let's go back to the index, or excuse me, the table of contents. And we can see that we have in Chapter 2, we have a section called Employee Eligibility. And we can see that starts on page 16. So let's go to page 16. Here we are. Okay, so you can see it says Employee Eligibility. So here we're going to look at the requirements. Here we go. Let me go ahead and get the annotation thing going. Okay, so we have an eligible employee, has to work for a covered employer, has worked for the employer for at least 12 months. Okay, again, doesn't have to be consecutive, and we have here the 12 months do not have to be consecutive. So this, it's important you keep this in mind. And has worked at least 1,250 hours during the last 12-month period. Okay, so these are the 2 requirements, keeping in mind this related issue that we're looking at for eligible employees. Eligible employees include hourly individuals, include commissioned individuals, include salaried individuals. It also doesn't really care about what the background of the employee is. Maybe the employee caused this injury to himself or herself, maybe intentionally, like a suicide situation, or maybe inadvertently they OD'd on a drug that they were taking. They could be a bad person. Maybe you found out some awful things about this person, that they are a bad criminal, just at the same time they're requesting FMLA leave. None of that will affect their ability to take FMLA leave. It's not a character study about this particular person. Another thing that sometimes comes up is that you may find that if you permit this, is that you may have a married couple work together in a working environment. They both have FMLA protections. So you could have a situation where they're both out for some period of time. There are some particular rules with well baby care, but when they each are having their own serious health conditions, they're both having the entitlement to use that time to treat their particular circumstances. Okay, so now we've talked about covered employers and we've talked about covered employees. Now we're going to talk about covered events. When can a covered employee, be able to take this leave? And we can see that's covered under Chapter 3. So we're going to go to page 23. Page 23 provides an overview, but we're going to start on 23 and then we're going to go to some later pages for a little bit deeper dive into this subject. Okay, here are these same categories that we saw on the PowerPoint. Let me just go ahead and I consider these categories a little bit misleading. I'm going to be honest with you. And the thing that I find misleading is this expression, serious health condition. It's statutory, so it's not the fault of the Department of Labor. By the way, this particular statute is not administered by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, by a completely different federal agency called the Department of Labor Wage and Hour Administration. It's a more aggressive agency than the EOC, so while it's always important to comply with the law, of course, it's really important to kind of make sure you're not messing up here. So this term serious health condition is not defined in the statute, and you can see how people could interpret this differently. You could imagine, for example, a conservative senator who might say, well, serious health conditions are things like cancer, dementia, blindness, being in a wheelchair, really, really serious things that, you know, we want to protect people. We don't want to protect people from the garden variety flu or bronchitis or something like that. We want to cover the really serious things. Then you could imagine a more liberal senator saying, well, you know, if you're sick, it's serious to you. And if almost any illness can become serious if it's not treated appropriately. And certainly, we want to make sure that people get the medical care that they need and that they get the time off work that they need to maintain their good health. That's in everyone's benefit. So a serious health condition is a much broader term in that person's understanding of the term. So as you can see, because it really doesn't have a meaning that's objective, we have to really look to the regulations to figure out what this term means. And we do have more information going forward here. So I'm going to advance to the next page. First of all, we're going to do the refresher about what the immediate family members are. It's spouse, parent, or son, or daughter. And again, there can be times where somebody can have somebody be a son or daughter who they're not the biological or adoptive parents. This is especially true in the step-parent scenario. It could be that you marry Bob, and Bob was previously married to Louise, and Bob and Louise share custody of little Tammy. You aren't going to adopt Tammy. Tammy already has a mom in a different household. But Tammy spends a pretty significant amount of time in your household, and you have developed a parental-like relationship with her. You help her with her homework, you tuck her in at night when she's staying at your house, you discipline her when it's appropriate, you love her and she loves you, or maybe she doesn't love you, but in any event, you are a parental figure in your life. In those situations, even though you don't have a legal relationship, you would be considered in loco parentis. Let me see if that term is, yeah, in loco parentis. Now, of course, if you were just babysitting somebody for a period of time, you're not going to be in loco parentis, even if that person were a family member, even if it were for several weeks. So it doesn't apply all the time, but it could in certain step-parent relations cross that line. Another thing that's not covered as a covered event would be cosmetic surgery. Let's say I decided I had a larger nose than I would like, or I wanted to trim my waistline and get some liposuction. Perfectly reasonable things to want to do, but they are not necessary medically. And so therefore, while I could certainly do those things, my employer is not required to give me time off to do those things. The one exception would be if I'm getting these types of medical treatments because it's related to some kind of disability or medical condition that I have. For example, let's say that I had breast cancer, and so I had a mastectomy. I might want to have reconstructive surgery so that I would appear to have a normal-sized breast. And so even though that is in some sense cosmetic surgery, because it's designed to return me to the condition I was in prior to my cancer, that would be an FMLA event. Let's say I had some burns and I might want to have some skin grafts at a later date to repair the cosmetic damage that the burns have done. That would be a situation where FMLA would cover those particular circumstances. Infertility treatments could be covered by FMLA, would be another example. But let's go forward onto page 25 to see a little bit more details about serious health condition. Actually, we're going to look at the table here on page 26. One would be is if a person has an overnight stay at a hospital, that is by definition, you've been admitted, that's by definition a serious health condition. And it's not just that day that you spent in the hospital, but all the recovery both before or after that's related to that particular issue. So if the person is able to demonstrate to you that they stayed overnight in the hospital, then that whole event that is going to be an FMLA event. Another thing that's going to be covered is anything having to do with pregnancy or prenatal care. This could be morning sickness, this could be prenatal visits, this could be delivery and childbirth and recovery from that childbirth. A pregnant woman is not required to get a doctor's note every time she has morning sickness. Simply having the diagnosis of pregnancy, and if she says, I'm having complications, it could be morning sickness, it could be some other symptoms relating to the pregnancy that make it impossible for her to come to work on a day or to come to work at a particular time. Those would be FMLA events. And honestly, there's not going to be any way that an employer is going to be able to confirm that. There's no test that you'll be able to prove that whether Sally really had morning sickness that morning or whether she just didn't want to get up. There's not going to be a mechanism for the employer to confirm that. Now, of course, FMLA leave is typically not paid, so Sally does have a motivation to come in if she wants to get her paycheck for that period of time. Then we also have chronic conditions. So somebody who has asthma or migraine headaches doesn't need a doctor's note every time they happen to have an incident. They do need to have documentation that they happen to have this condition. But going forward, many times, let's say someone has asthma, they may have some regimen of treatment that they undergo, taking certain breath treatments, or maybe if they have a migraine, they might take certain medication, or maybe they need to be in a dark room, maybe they need to be laying down, things like that. Again, would there be proof that they would have to present to the employer to prove they actually had a migraine or they actually had an asthma event? No, they're not going to be required to prove. They would be required to prove they have that diagnosis generally, but not that particular incident. So you can see how there can be some opportunities for people to play the system. On the other hand, these are serious conditions that reasonably can cause people to miss work. We can also have long-term conditions that might be terminal, for example, like cancer or Alzheimer's. In many cases, these individuals won't be returning to work at all. They will be off for the whole 12 weeks of their period of time, and then at the end of that, then the employer makes a decision whether to sever the employment relationship or continue some other type of long-term leave. In some situations, it may be possible for the person to return from time to time, even though they have a bad prognosis. There may be conditions where the person needs to take multiple treatments. Cancer is a very common situation here, but it can be other conditions. Perhaps they're receiving chemotherapy or radiation therapy or bone marrow treatments or some other treatment. The person might need just a little bit of time off, or they might need an extensive period of time off. Another situation could be people who have kidney failure who need dialysis treatment. But all of the ones I've covered so far are important categories, and they all present their own challenges, but probably the big one is going to be this first one. First one in the continuing treatment category. Let's look at this. It's called incapacity plus treatment. A period of incapacity more than 3 consecutive full calendar days, and any subsequent treatment or period of incapacity relating to that same condition. So it's that period plus anything else that involves 2 or more in-person visits to a healthcare provider, or at least 1 in-person visit to a healthcare provider, which results in a regimen of continuing treatment. For example, the healthcare provider might provide prescription medication. So, if I am sick for more than 3 days and I see the doctor and the doctor prescribes me medication, a prescription, something I have to, go to the pharmacist for. So, more than 3 days sick, doctor's visit, prescription, I am going to have an FMLA event. Those are the only things I need to do. We all know that when we go to see a doctor, if we want a prescription, it's very likely the doctor will give us a prescription. Or alternatively, if we can just go back and see the doctor a second time. And that will be another way of accomplishing that task. It's quite unlikely that a doctor is going to refuse to see you a second time if you're willing to make your copay. And so under those circumstances, you can see how a person who wants to make an event, an FMLA event, if he or she understands this formula, he or she can be successful. Now, some questions come up about the 3 consecutive full days. Let's say that Mary is scheduled to work Mondays, Thursdays, and Fridays. That's her work week. She calls off sick on Monday. And actually, so she calls off sick on Monday. She tells you, yeah, gosh, I've been so sick today, and I was sick yesterday too. She doesn't call in on Tuesday or Wednesday because she's off. She comes in on Thursday and she goes, yeah, I'm feeling better, boy, but I was still sick on Tuesday and Wednesday. So she tells you that she was sick for 4 days, which is more than 3 consecutive full days, even though she only missed 1 day. She also works into conversation, yeah, I took Monday off. I went to see the doctor. I got some antibiotics, and, they finally kicked in this morning, and I do feel like I can come to work. Well, guess what? She has said all of the things that are required for the incapacity plus treatment. She said she was sick for more than 3 consecutive days. She said she saw a doctor. She said that she has a prescription medication. So even though she just missed 1 day, that 1 day is an FMLA event. Now, she has to have given you this other information. If all she calls off and tells you she's sick on Monday but doesn't tell you any of the rest of this, you don't know there's an FMLA event involved. But once she does know all of this information, or once you know all this information, then if you were to say discipline her for this absence, let's say was on the cusp of getting into disciplinary issues because of her absence, and this is the one that pushes her over into the disciplinary category. Well, guess what? You violated the Family Medical Leave Act if you are a covered employer and she's a covered employee. This certainly is a covered event. That's why it's such a complex area, and that's why once you have an employee who has crossed that 1 year of service line, before you dismiss her or him for absence-related reasons that she has claimed that some of the absences, or he has claimed some of the absences, are illness related or family member illness related, you really need to have an HR professional or an attorney advise you on how to proceed in those cases. So anyway, we've covered some of the high points of this manual. What I've covered here today should help you navigate the assignment that we have for this particular chapter. If you have questions about FMLA, please feel free to come and see me. I'll be happy to help you work through the assignment and also help you master the material perhaps in more detail. At this point, we're going to end this first lecture. We have now at this point covered employment relationships, we've covered workplace discrimination and sexual harassment, and we've covered the Family Medical Leave Act. In the next lecture, we'll continue on and cover more material in this chapter. As always, if you have questions, please email me with questions about the material, or, this is even better, come by and see me. I'll be delighted to sit down and chat with you, and we can kind of do a deeper dive into the material. I thank you for your attention. I hope this has been helpful for you. Have a wonderful day.